Okay, yes, Toby, you did say this is a completely different world, unrelated to Undertale, har har. What I'm saying is, I just don't believe you. Okay, so by now, Deltarune has had enough time to circulate, just about a month now in fact, and I've seen just about as many theory, lore, speculation videos that I never even thought was humanly possible to digest in the short span of around, 3 days or so. And after silently lurking around on YouTube's suggested section and perusing various wikis and articles, cramming just about all of the Undertale lore information that could possibly fit in my head, I finally decided to pounce on this thing myself. And I believe I have more than a couple cents to add to the pile, so let's get started. If you haven't yet played Deltarune, then, well, first of all, why the hell are you watching this? And second, it became immediately apparent that it wasn't really the game you were probably thinking it was. I mean, yeah, this certainly does feel like an Undertale sequel. It does have all the same characters at a first glance. I could totally see someone easily mistaking this as a canonical continuation of the Undertale storyline. But the more you explore around, the more it becomes evident that, well, this isn't exactly your grandma's Undertale, is it? No, there's something a little fishy going on here. Characters that knew each other previously no longer have a relationship with one another. People act, look, and are dressed differently. Certain characters have met different outcomes in life, and some of them aren't even alive. The best way I've heard others describe it is that this is to Majora's Mask as Undertale is to Ocarina of Time. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Almost as if Undertale were a jigsaw puzzle you've taken hours to finish, just in time for your big brother to come stomping into your room with a rubber mallet and then proceeds to just smash it into pieces. This is still Undertale, just a little rearranged. If you're an Undertale fanatic, I'm going to try my absolute best and gather evidence from both Undertale and Deltarune and do everything I can to put this puzzle back together, or at the very least make a little sense out of what this new game is trying to tell us. I'm going to start by explaining some of the relationships between the characters of Deltarune and Undertale, and then I'll segue into some more popular concepts that have been scoped out and theorized by other creators on here, including the big one that we'll get to later on. And finally, after that, I'm going to be adding some of my own speculation, and I'm going to be bringing a couple of these theories together for the sake of looking at Deltarune from a fresh perspective. Timestamps are included. Feel free to skip around the video if you'd like, but this is probably going to make a lot more sense if watched completely through, so get settled and strap in for a long one, boys. I believe you'll find what I've put together to be really interesting. The very first things on the list we need to address are Deltarune's parallels to the Undertale universe, specifically the relationships of some of the characters. As Toby has already confirmed, this new game, Deltarune, has absolutely nothing to do with Undertale as a game. This resulted in the meme where people put together the anagram for Deltarune and Undertale was also the word unrelated, which is a nice, clever insight and all, but if we're being real with ourselves, there's sadly nothing that really confirms this anagram was intentional. It may seem like just a bunch of clever wordplay on the surface, but I think Toby is doing much more than just rearranging the title of his game like he's trying to play Scrabble or something. Toby's hint, or I guess lack thereof, immediately got everyone talking about alternate timelines and such, and for an understandable reason. Because as a game, the two titles may not hold any relation to each other, sure, but to say the two games are literally worlds apart despite having the same exact characters, some of which even have similar relationships to each other as they did in Undertale, no, something is going on here. And as per usual, when the phrase alternate timelines got thrown into the mix, this sent just about every theorizer on the internet into an adrenaline-fueled fury to search for further significance. Of course, everyone immediately jumped to Gaster as the main culprit, the name in which one is basically required to bring up whenever talking about interdimensional timey-wimey stuff in the Undertale universe. And make no mistake, Gaster is in this world, just not the way you think he would be. There's the air quotes secret underground bunker in the, again air quotes, real world. When standing by the door will trigger a muffled and distorted sound that, when sped up, will definitely remind you of a certain character. But despite the infamous Gaster leaving traces of himself throughout Deltarune, I don't believe that's really what's at play here. So let's analyze this big theory that I brought up earlier. This is a theory that completely rejects the notion of there being a dark world in the first place, evidenced by the contents of the playroom when Susie and Kris exit the dark world. The pawnmen, the checker enemies, an old doll, and other contents found in the room seem to suggest the dark world as sort of a down the rabbit hole dream area that only exists in the heads of the characters. Everything you fought or saw in the dark world has a real world counterpart, and it's almost as if the game just smacks you with the stark realization that, yeah, everything you just fought against, all that prophecy, lancer, playing card, chess checker, fantasy bullshit did in fact have an extremely simple explanation. It goes like this. Kris uses his imagination as a means of escape from something far more brooding in his real life. If you ever notice the not so implicitly told relationship between Toriel and Asgore, let me oblige. Toriel and Asgore were once a couple, of course, but sadly, for whatever unknown reason, they are currently divorced in the events of the game, leaving Toriel as the primary caretaker for our boy Kris here. Exploring around a little more, you can find evidence of Toriel's trash can emanating with the pungent smell of flowers and roses. Take this piece of knowledge and match it with Asgore sending you back with a bouquet of flowers upon your visit, you put two and two together, and suddenly we end up with a pretty vivid retelling of Kris's family history, and some of what went down between them. And at this point, I'd just like to go ahead and reiterate that this is not yet me stating my own original theory, for this is actually a pretty easy conclusion to arrive to with lots of solid evidence that numerous creators have already discovered. I'm only giving everyone a quick rundown of this theory because it contains information that's critical to my own. So anyway, as we strike up conversations with other characters around the hometown area, it slowly begins coming together that something in the Dreamer family household yielded a major conflict. As Toriel and Asgore call it quits, this leaves Kris feeling very isolated and alone. And through a majority of the divorce, Asriel, his brother, assumes the role of his caretaker and his emotional crutch. But of course, Asriel has bigger obligations to attend to, and he eventually leaves his own home to embark on college, leaving Kris, well, even more alone. This is all evidence that builds up to the suggestion that this so-called dark world isn't really a world at all, but only an emotional escape, a defense mechanism for Kris to cope with the stress of a divorced household. Your carbon core sword reverting back to a pencil upon re-entering the real world, other items in your inventory suddenly changing to their real-world equivalents, Asriel even making an appearance at the end of Kris's imaginative acid trip of a story because his imagination is the only place where he can talk to his brother. Wow, that's just depressing. And the evidence for this theory doesn't stop there. There's books of evidence around that all seem to be pointing to Kris's troubled family life and using his imagination as a coping mechanism to fight being alone. Everyone else in his school are monsters, reflecting Kris's deep-seated fear of socializing with anyone else other than his own imagination. Susie even points out to us that Kris has always been a very quiet kid, even when being threatened with getting his face chewed off. His fond memories of drinking hot chocolate reminding him of times with Asriel. There's quite a lot to this theory, and while I actually find myself agreeing with this theory for quite a bit just because of the overwhelming amount of evidence, I kept defaulting back to one question that I continually asked myself. Does this sound like a story that a developer like Toby would try to tell? And you can answer that in your own way, as everyone will have their own reasons for arriving to their conclusions, but once I began asking myself this, it was then that I started noticing things that were off in the hometown area, the part of the game that is, according to this theory, supposed to be very real. And if we aren't counting the underground bunker at the very bottom of the hometown, then there's also the somewhat unexplained and spontaneous appearance of Sans, the only character that seems to bear immunity to Deltarune's jumbled up mess. His personality is the same, he still alludes to his younger brother, whom we can assume is still Papyrus, and he even cleverly slips in the insinuation that he's actually met you before, only under different circumstances. Also, just something that I happened to notice, and I hope it'll make you freak out as much as I did, but to the Undertale veterans here, I'm sure you remember the door to Sans' bedroom? It, looks a little familiar, doesn't it? Considering all of this, it feels like even though Deltarune and Undertale may not be related in the sense that one comes before or after the other, the evidence of these two games being canonically related in at least some way are glaringly apparent. Before delving into my own findings, I'm first going to give you a couple examples of why I believe the Deltarune timeline, although separate from its parent game, holds more relevance to the canon of Undertale than we're giving it credit for. So, firstly, while we're on the topic of Sans, let's go ahead and talk about his significance in Deltarune. Unlike almost all of the other characters, Sans seems completely unaltered in any way. His appearance is the same, his dialogue is marked by the same trademark silly typeface in which he's named after, and the text window that pops up when interacting with his house next door, you're given a pretty heavy insinuation that Papyrus still retains his relationship with Sans as his little brother. We don't see Papyrus anywhere, but it makes sense that he would likely be unaltered as well. This isn't some alternate reality version of Sans. This is the exact same friendly face we talked to 3 years ago. And this makes a ton of sense because if you remember, Sans' level of self-awareness was only matched by a couple other characters. While everyone else is concerned with hunting humans and whatnot, Sans is over here talking to you about rips in the space-time continuum, timelines jumping left and right, stopping and starting, and all of this time travel jargon. So that in itself makes it pretty clear that this game is certainly not above throwing you into another timeline without explanation. But give me just a minute, I've got something even better. If Sans' discussion over timelines and his bedroom door being used as Deltarune's fast travel door isn't enough of an indication that there's something going on with Sans, how about his secret workshop in the first game? Take a look near the blueprints on the desk. If you played Undertale after a certain patch, there would have been a small photograph stashed away inside the binder. Take it, and a text window tells you this is a photograph of 3 smiling people. Written on the back of the photo in all lowercase letters are, "Don't forget." All lowercase letters. Oh, you mean like the title of the game? Actually, come to think of it, I think I've heard this from somewhere before, haven't I?
Don't forget.
Holy shit, Toby. Sans being a time traveler of sorts has been a classic theory for a while, but this pretty much does all but confirm our suspicions of Sans being in Deltarune are probably true. Sans seems to have a knack for popping up in timelines whenever shit's about to go wrong, but as mind-blown as I was upon finding that photograph, it almost made me completely forget about the fact that a prophecy actually does exist in Undertale, and it's more or less the same prophecy told at the beginning cutscene of Deltarune, only instead of below and above, the two opposing forces are light and dark. Gerson even mentions this. The Deltarune prophecy he speaks of predicts that an angel from the above world will journey underground to set the monsters free from their mortal realm. This angel from the prophecy ends up being either Azrael destroying the barrier during the pacifist route, or Chara just outright murdering everyone during the genocide route. Either way, the prophecy ends up being fulfilled. So, okay, back up. Rusty, wait. You said you'd be hypothesizing your own theory, and I've yet to hear you mumble a single new contribution to the Deltarune mystery. Everything you've said so far is just stuff we already know about the game. Okay, fine. Here it is. I've just underlined the 2 most popular community theories, Kris using the Dark World as an escape from his struggling home life, versus a completely alternate timeline where we've been given every indication in the world that something extremely bad is about to happen, and whatever that thing is, we get a quick glance at during the end of the first chapter. It seems like you either believe in one theory or the other at this point, and it's actually beginning to be quite a divisive topic to discuss among other fans. Much like how people are quick to argue against the relation of Undertale to Deltarune, people seem just as quick to drive a wedge between these 2 theories, when in reality, you can't really deny that both of these theories have pretty solid grounding evidence. I believe there's a reason for that. The reason being, both of these theories work so well because they tell the same story. These 2 theories are inseparable, and they explain a lot more when we let them work together. So here's my reasoning. Let's comb through the family history one more time. So in a nutshell, Kris gets adopted by the Dreamer family, resulting in Asriel becoming Kris's adoptive brother, and Toriel and Asgore respectively becoming Kris's adoptive mother and father. Kris becomes the only human in a town populated with monsters and strange creatures. He falls into a giant hole and finds out that he's part of a prophecy in another world. He's really shy, seems to enjoy chocolate a little too much, and this is all beginning to sound really familiar. We've heard of this story before, haven't we? It's not only the story of Kris, but also the story of the first fallen human in Undertale's prophecy. It's Chara, the primary negative influence in Undertale, the bigger bad of the game's story, the person whose power is enough to even penetrate through the parameters of the game and talk to not you the character, but you the player. Kris doesn't just look like Chara, no, Kris's entire backstory is paralleled almost to a T by Chara, the shy, polite human child turned sadistic, ravaging mass murderer, taken in by the Dreamer family. But let's put the brakes on this theory train before it goes somewhere I don't want it to. I was so ready to end this script by just telling how Kris is actually Chara in disguise. When looking at their family lives, the evidence is just about as plain can get, but I feel like hopping on the SS Kris's Chara confirmed ship is a bit too easy of an answer. Chara is one of the only characters in Undertale that can directly override the player's ability to make a decision, despite the entire game being about how free you are to make your own choices. This is a character that literally has the power to wipe an entire world clean of monsters, erasing all life in existence Thanos style, and leaving nothing behind. A display of power so massive that even a true pacifist run on the same save file will not prevent the game from remembering your initial bad decisions. And if Chara can destroy worlds this easily, Chara can probably make them as well. After all, Chara is one of the few characters that can override the player's decision making, so it would make sense that a world in which your choices don't matter would be a world Chara either created or at the very least wants to preside over. And that's not me just wearing a tinfoil hat or anything. Chara literally tells us this at the end of Undertale's genocide route. Let's erase this pointless world and move on to the next. That's some BioShock Infinite shit right there. Now let's think about Asriel. Not Ralsei, but the Asriel character from the first game. For essentially the length of the entire game, we were conditioned to pin up Asriel and Chara as the two integral polar opposites. Asriel seems to get recognition for just about everything. He's the one that gets shown with affection and spotlighted for all of his accomplishments, leaving Chara only to be neglected for the most part. And going off the assertion that this was in fact a world Chara created, it would make sense for Chara to want to live out a fantasy where the roles are reversed, and instead of fighting against darkness, you're fighting against light, doing things like banishing the angels' heaven. Sounds like a pretty dark thing to do to me. Chara wanted to create a world where darkness is instead aligned to be positive, and light is the enemy. A story where Chara gets all the spotlight and Asriel, the angel of death, is the villain. And get this, Ralsei is not part of Deltarune's prophecy. The prophecy tells of three heroes, a human, a monster, and a prince of the dark. The first two are obviously our pair of classroom adventurers, but a prince of the dark? Well, considering the fourth main character is actually the son of a king, and therefore better fits the criteria of being a prince of the dark than Ralsei, this leaves his position in this story to be kind of up in the air. He's the odd man out, and I believe he is for the reason that I just explained. It's Chara's turn to be in control of the story now. It's why Kris is the one taking charge and is considered the leader of the gang, not his older brother. It's why when Ralsei reveals his appearance bearing uncanny similarity to Asriel, Kris reacts later that night by cleansing himself of the last little bit of humanity he had left. Ralsei unveiled his own self, and Chara has taken that as a cue to do the same. When everything is looked at from this perspective, Ralsei suddenly looks very out of place, like he doesn't really belong or contribute to anything in the grand scheme. Ralsei is the villain. The prophetic angel of death has turned out to be the demon of Chara's own story, as a direct result of Asriel being treated as the family favorite for so long. This isn't the story of Kris or Frisk. There's no war or major conflict between humans and monsters in this timeline, evidenced by the fact that they can at least get along in a classroom setting just fine, but instead a war between the forces of light and dark, a war that will be waged between two of Undertale's most powerful entities, a war that hasn't yet happened, but as told by the prophecy, it's coming. And if Undertale's genocide ending was any indication of the power we're looking at, this makes me very afraid for what we're going to see in the coming chapters.
But hey, that's just a theory. Okay.
No, just stop. I'm fucking done with that dead meme. Thanks for tuning into The Forge. I'm Rusty. Feel free to watch my original Deltarune video here if you just can't contain yourself, and I'll see you there. Peace.